Right now, you are wearing something. Maybe it's a hoodie. Maybe it's a business shirt with a collar that's slightly too tight. Maybe you're in pajamas, half asleep, scrolling through this with one eye open. Whatever it is, you put it on without thinking. You grabbed it, pulled it over your head or zipped it up, and moved on with your day. Clothing for you is background noise. It's as automatic as breathing. But here's the thing. That automatic gesture, that reach for fabric before you face the world, is one of the oldest human behaviors on the planet. Older than agriculture, older than writing, older than the wheel. The simple act of covering your body connects you to a chain of humans, stretching back so far that the number almost stops making sense. You probably think clothing started with civilization, with weavers and merchants and ancient cities humming with trade. Maybe you picture Egyptian linen, or Roman togas, or medieval peasants in rough-spun wool. And yes, those are all real. But here's what actually happened. The real story of the first outfit begins not in a city, not even in a village. It begins in a cave in the dark, with a needle made of bone and a dead animal on the floor. And it begins much, much earlier than anyone expected. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists assumed clothing was relatively recent, a few tens of thousands of years maybe, something that emerged as humans moved into colder climates and needed insulation, practical, functional, boring almost. The standard story went like this. Humans got cold. Humans grabbed animal skins, problem solved. End of chapter. But here's what nobody tells you. The evidence doesn't support that story at all. And when researchers started looking more carefully, not just at fabric and fiber, which rot away and leave almost nothing behind, but at the tiny, unexpected things that cling to clothing long after the clothing itself is gone. The entire timeline collapsed backward by tens of thousands of years. The first major clue didn't come from cloth. It came from lice. In 2011, David Reed at the University of Florida published a study in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution that did something extraordinary. He used genetic sequencing to trace the evolutionary split between head lice and body lice. Now you might wonder why anyone cares about lice. But this is where it gets interesting. Body lice, the kind that live in clothing, not on your scalp, did not exist before clothing existed. They evolved specifically to live in fabric. So when you find the point in time when head lice and body lice genetically diverged, you find the moment when humans started wearing clothes regularly enough for a new species of parasite to evolve to exploit that behavior. Think about that. Lice became our first accidental fashion historians. Reed's analysis found that body lice diverged from head lice somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. 170,000 years. That pushes the origin of clothing deep into the Middle Stone Age, into a period when anatomically modern humans were still sharing the African continent with other hominid species. This wasn't a response to the Ice Age. This wasn't about survival in the cold. At 170,000 years ago, humans in Africa weren't facing freezing temperatures. Something else was driving this behavior. Something more complicated. Something more human. Here's what that means. If people were wearing clothes so many thousand years ago in sub-Saharan Africa, where temperatures were warm, they weren't doing it to stay warm. They were doing something else entirely. Maybe they were doing it for protection from sun and insects. Maybe they were doing it for status, for identity, for ritual. Maybe, and this is the part that should make you pause, they were doing it for the same swirling mess of social and psychological reasons. You do it today. To signal something. To belong somewhere. To be someone. But let's go back even further, because the lice study gives us a window. And through that window, we can see something even older. In 2021, Francesco De Rico at the University of Bordeaux and his team published findings related to a site called Contrabandier's Cave in Morocco. What they found there, in sediment layers dating to approximately 20,000 years ago, were bones. Specifically, the bones of large carnivores, primarily leopards and servals, that had been carefully cut and scraped in a very particular way. Not the way you'd process an animal for meat. The cut marks were in all the wrong places for that. Instead, the pattern suggested that someone was removing the pelt cleanly and carefully, the way you would if you wanted to preserve the skin intact and wearable. There were also bones that showed signs of being used as tools for scraping hide. This was not butchery. This was tailoring. The team also found eagle talons and feathers prepared in ways that suggested decorative use. Someone, 120,000 years ago on the Atlantic coast of Africa, was not just covering themselves. They were accessorizing. They were making choices about how they looked. They had an aesthetic. And here is where the story takes a turn that should genuinely unsettle you. Because we tend to think of aesthetics, of caring how you look, as something that came late, as a luxury, as something that only emerges once survival is secured and you have time to be vain. But the evidence says the opposite. The evidence says that caring about appearance is not a product of civilization. It is one of the behaviors that made us human in the first place. Let's keep building the picture. Because Contrabandier's Cave is not alone at Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, researchers have found evidence of ochre processing, the grinding of red and yellow iron, oxides into pigment, dating back 100,000 years. This is one of the oldest known examples of humans producing a substance specifically for its visual properties. Ochre was almost certainly used to color skin and, we now believe, to color hides and early clothing as well. Francesco Derico and Christopher Henshelwood, who has led excavations at Blombos, published findings in Science in 2002 and in subsequent papers through the 2010s, showing that these pigment workshops were systematic, repeated, and clearly part of a regular behavioral practice. People weren't just surviving at Blombos. They were artists. They were designing. Meanwhile, at a site called Sibudu Cave in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, archaeologist Lynn Wadley of the University of the Witwatersrand has spent years excavating layers of ancient human occupation going back 77,000 years. What she found, published in multiple papers, including a landmark 2011 study in Science, included plant, bedding materials, evidence of heat treatment for tool making, and crucially, bone awls. Awls are pointed tools used to pierce holes in material. If you're sewing, you need an awl. And if you're finding awls this old, then someone 77,000 years. Ego was piecing things together, was making something from parts, was in some early form constructing a garment. That's 77,000 years ago. Let's hold that number in our heads for a moment. The oldest surviving piece of woven textile, actual fabric that you could theoretically hold in your hand, is from Çatalhöyük in Turkey, and it dates to about 7,000 years ago. That's incredible, of course. But it means that between the first needle and the first surviving cloth, there's a gap of 70,000 years of clothing, history that has almost entirely vanished. Think about everything that was worn and made and designed and discarded and rotted away in those 70,000 years. Think about how many first outfits existed, how many choices were made, how many people stood in the cold or the sun and pulled something over their shoulders and felt, for a moment, like themselves. We know almost none of it, and that loss is staggering. But we can piece together more from the archaeological record. In 2016, a study led by Bruce Hardy at Kenyon College and Marie-Hélène Moncel at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris examined plant fibers found at the site of Abri du Marat in France. The site dates to roughly 90,000 years ago, and those plant fibers were twisted, deliberately, precisely twisted, into what appears to be a cord. Now, cord is not clothing, but cord is braiding, and braiding is weaving, and weaving is textile. This is the oldest direct evidence of humans twisting fiber into something structural. It is the deep root of every thread in the shirt you're currently wearing. Let's pause here. We are looking at a chain of evidence. Bone awls at 77,000 years ago, twisted cord at 90,000 years, hide-working tools at 120,000 years, and lice telling us that clothing was established enough, regular enough, universal enough, for a parasite to evolve around it as far back as 170,000 years ago. These are not isolated finds. This is a pattern. This is a story about a species that looked at the world and decided, very early in its existence, that the self was something worth presenting, something worth shaping. Here's what nobody really talks about. The first outfit wasn't made from necessity, not primarily. It was made from imagination. Think about the leopard skins at Contrebandier Cave. A leopard is one of the most dangerous animals on the African savanna. To kill one, skin it, and wear its pelt requires not just physical ability, but a specific kind of thinking. You have to imagine yourself wearing it before you kill it. You have to want the result before the process begins. That is future thinking. That is planning. And planning in cognitive evolution is one of the markers we use to distinguish modern human thought from everything that came before. The first outfit was not just clothing. It was the physical proof that someone could hold an image of themselves in their mind and then make that image real. That is not survival. That is identity. And identity is in many ways the most human thing there is. Now here is the unexpected connection that reframes all of this. You get dressed every morning, and you probably don't think of it as anything special. You open a drawer or a closet, you make fast decisions, and you go. But what you are actually doing, the gesture itself, the act of choosing what goes on your body before you face other people, is a 170,000-year-old social ritual. The anxiety you might feel about what to wear to a job interview or a first date, that is ancient. The relief you feel when you find the right thing, ancient. The way a new piece of clothing can make you feel more confident, more yourself, more ready, that is not vanity. That is a cognitive behavior so deep in our species that it predates our migrations out of Africa. You are not being shallow when you care what you wear. You are being deeply, profoundly human. Let's zoom out and look at what this tells us about who we are. Because there is a societal implication here that goes beyond fashion history. We live in a world that has, in recent decades, made clothing almost absurdly cheap. The average American buys around 68 garments per year, according to data compiled by the American Apparel and Footwear Association. Most of those garments are made by underpaid workers in factories far away, from synthetic fibers that will take 200 years to decompose in a landfill, and most of them will be worn fewer than 7 times before they're discarded. The fast fashion industry produces roughly 92 million tons of textile waste each year. That number, from a 2020 report by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, represents an almost incomprehensible distance from where this story began. Here's the contrast: 92 million tons of annual waste. And 170,000 years ago, someone on the coast of Morocco carefully, deliberately skinned a leopard to make something that mattered, something they would wear as identity, as status, as protection, as art. They would have worn that skin until it fell apart. They might have repaired it. They would have known every mark on it. The first outfit was made with total intention. What we make now is made to be forgotten. And there's something painful in that gap. Not because ancient humans were better or purer, they weren't. They were complicated, violent, brilliant people doing what they could with what they had. But the gesture was real. The meaning was embedded in the object itself, in the labor of making it, in the risk of acquiring it. When that person in Morocco wrapped themselves in that leopard skin, on 20,000 years ago, the outfit was not background noise. It was the foreground. It was a statement about who they were and what they were capable of. Now let's talk about something that almost never comes up in these conversations: the role of other people in the origin of clothing. You cannot sew a hide alone. Not easily, not well. Hide preparation requires soaking, scraping, stretching, and treating the skin to keep it supple. Making a garment from it requires cutting, piecing, and joining. These are multi-step, multi-session tasks. They're labor-intensive. And the tools we find at these ancient sites, the awls, the scrapers, the perforated shells, suggest not one person working alone, but a social practice, a shared skill, something taught and passed down. This means that the first outfit was also a product of community. Someone taught someone else how to do this. Knowledge was transferred. A tradition was born. And that tradition of learning how to make clothing, of passing down the skill, of belonging to a group that knows how to dress, is the direct ancestor of every fashion school. Every sewing circle, every grandmother teaching a child to hem a pair of pants. When you learned to tie your shoes, or button a shirt, or thread a needle, you were participating in a chain of instruction that goes back tens of thousands of years. You are not just wearing clothes. You are inheriting a practice. In 2020, Raul González José, at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina, published research examining the spread of clothing technology across human populations as they migrated out of Africa. The data suggests that as humans moved into colder climates, into the steppes of Central Asia, into the glaciated landscapes of Ice Age, Europe, they did not invent cold weather clothing from scratch. They brought the knowledge with them. The cognitive and technical toolkit for making clothing was already present in the human population long before it was needed for warmth. It was part of the cultural package that early Homo sapiens carried as they moved across the planet. Clothing didn't follow humans into the cold. Humans brought clothing with them, and the cold just gave them a new reason to use it. Here's what that means in practice. The first people to enter Europe, roughly 45,000 years ago, arriving in a landscape of glaciers and woolly mammoths and winters that would kill an unprotected human in hours, were not starting from zero. They were not figuring out on the fly how to survive the cold. They already knew. They had inherited, from generations of ancestors in Africa, the knowledge of how to work a hide, how to stitch a seam, how to make something that fit a body and stayed on and did its job. They walked into one of the harshest environments on Earth, wearing, in some sense, the accumulated wisdom of 100,000 years of making things. That is breathtaking. It really is. And it leads us to the oldest direct archaeological evidence of cold weather clothing construction, which comes from a site called Sunghir, near the city of Vladimir in Russia, dating to approximately 34,000 years ago. The burials there, documented extensively by researchers including Randall White at New York University, contain human remains surrounded by thousands of individually drilled ivory beads. The pattern in which those beads are arranged strongly suggests they were sewn onto garments, onto caps, tunics, trousers, and boots that have long since decayed. One burial, of an adult male, contains approximately 2,136 beads. Another burial, of two adolescents placed head to head, contains more than 5,000 beads between them. At maybe 45 minutes per bead to carve and drill, a generous estimate, those 5,000 beads represent somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,150 hours of work. That's nearly 2 full years of working 8 hours a day, every day. Let that land. These people spent 2 years of labor decorating the clothing of 2 children, not for warmth, for beauty, for love, for ceremony. The clothing was the tribute. The outfit was the message. Here's what nobody tells you about the first outfit. It was not the first thing humans made. They had already been making tools for millions of years. What the first outfit represented was something different. It was the first time humans made something for the self, for the projection of who you are into the world. The tool is about the task. The garment is about the person. And that shift, from making things for tasks to making things for identity, is arguably the hinge point of what we call human culture. Once you start caring about how you appear to others, once you start projecting a version of yourself through what you put on your body, you have crossed a threshold that nothing pushes you back from. You are in the realm of art, of story, of meaning-making. You are, in the most literal sense, modern. Let's bring this all the way home, because this story ends exactly where it started. Right now, you are wearing something. And now you know that the act of wearing it connects you backward through time to a person on the coast of Morocco, on 20,000 years ago, carefully preserving the skin of a leopard to wear as part of who they were, to someone at Sibidu Cave 77,000 years ago, pressing an awl through hide, learning to stitch, to 2 children laid to rest at Sunghir 34,000 years ago, their garments beaded with years of someone's love and labor, to every human who has ever stood before a choice of what to put on and felt. In that moment, the weight of the question, who am I today? You do that every morning. You've done it your whole life without knowing it was ancient. The closet you open is not just a closet, it is a continuation. The t-shirt you pull on without thinking, the jacket you choose because it makes you feel like yourself. Those gestures carry inside them the full depth of what it means to be the kind of creature that covers itself not just for warmth, but for meaning. Not just for protection, but for identity. Not just because the body needs it, but because the self demands it. Dressing is not a modern behavior. It is a founding human behavior. And every time you do it, you are repeating, in your own specific, personal, 21st century way, the very first act of self-expression our species ever performed. The first outfit was made by someone who looked at the world and decided they were going to show up in it on purpose. That person is still you. If this kind of story, the deep, surprising human history hiding inside everyday life, is what you're here for, then subscribe, because there are dozens more where this came from. Every ordinary thing you do has an extraordinary story behind it. We're just getting started.